Bullies kissed his crush during Truth or Dare. He turned the dare into war. Daniel Reeves had learned to make himself small. It was a skill he'd perfected over the course of 3 months at Riverside Heights High School, a sprawling brick institution that sat at the edge of a quiet California suburb where strip malls and tract housing stretched endlessly under pale blue skies. He was thin in a way that made his clothes hang awkwardly on his frame, his shoulders narrow beneath oversized hoodies, his wrists delicate where they emerged from sleeves he habitually pulled over his knuckles. Dark hair fell across his forehead in unruly waves that he never bothered to style, and his eyes, a deep brown that might have been striking under different circumstances, were usually fixed on the ground or the pages of whatever book he carried as a shield against the world. He'd moved to Riverside in late August when his father, a career military man with 2 decades in the Marines, had been reassigned to a logistics position at Camp Pendleton. The move had been sudden, ripping Daniel from a small base in North Carolina where he'd spent his teenage years in relative anonymity, training quietly in the base dojo under the watchful eye of Master Sergeant Torres, a combat instructor who'd taken an interest in the quiet boy who appeared every evening without fail. Daniel had earned his black belt at 16, had learned not just the mechanics of strikes and blocks, but the philosophy that undergirded them. Balance, restraint, the idea that true strength lay in protecting rather than destroying. His father knew about the training, but treated it with the same distant acknowledgement he afforded most aspects of Daniel's life, proud in an abstract way, but always too consumed with duty and deployment schedules to be truly present. At Riverside Heights, Daniel had tried to slip into the background, to become invisible among the 2,000 students who filled the hallways with their noise and their certainty. He'd succeeded too well. Within the first week, he'd been marked as prey by Tyler Brennan, the kind of student who seemed to exist in every American high school, tall and broad-shouldered with the easy confidence of someone who'd never been told no, whose father owned 3 car dealerships across the county and whose athletic prowess on the football field granted him immunity from consequence. Tyler had wheat blonde hair that he wore in that calculated, messy style that took more effort than it appeared, blue eyes that could shift from charming to cold in an instant, and a smile that promised friendship while delivering cruelty. The first incident had been minor, almost forgettable. Daniel had been navigating the crowded cafeteria during lunch, his tray laden with the standard institutional fare, rubbery pizza, wilted salad, a carton of milk, sweating condensation. He'd been searching for an empty table, somewhere along the periphery where he could eat in peace and lose himself in the novel he'd tucked into his backpack. He hadn't seen Tyler's foot snake out from beneath the table where the football players congregated, hadn't registered the trap until his shin connected with the obstacle and he was stumbling forward, his tray tilting, his body off balance. The crash had been spectacular. Pizza and milk exploded across the industrial tile floor, and Daniel had barely caught himself on his hands, pain shooting through his palms as they scraped concrete. The cafeteria had gone momentarily silent, hundreds of eyes turning to witness his humiliation before erupting into laughter that echoed off the high ceilings. Tyler had stood, feigning concern, his voice loud enough to carry. "Oh man, sorry about that. You okay, buddy? Didn't see you there." The apology had been performance, delivered with a smirk that his friends reflected back at him. Jake Morrison, Tyler's constant shadow, a stocky kid with a neck like a fire hydrant and a flat-top haircut that made him look perpetually angry, had added his own commentary. "Maybe you should watch where you're going, new kid." Brad Cutler, lean and mean with acne scars across his cheeks and a reputation for taking things too far, had whistled low. "That's gonna leave a mark." Devin Hayes, the cruelest of the group in some ways because his attacks came wrapped in humor, had called out, "Someone get this guy some training wheels for his feet." Daniel had gathered his tray in silence, had walked to the disposal area while his face burned and his hands shook, had spent the rest of lunch period in a bathroom stall trying to master his breathing the way Master Torres had taught him. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. He'd told himself it was nothing, that high school was temporary, that he'd survived worse. His father had been deployed for most of his childhood, and his mother had died when he was young enough that her face existed only in photographs now. He'd learned early to endure, but Tyler Brennan didn't believe in one-time incidents. He believed in establishing dominance, in making examples, in ensuring that everyone understood the hierarchy. The cafeteria incident became the first in a series of calculated humiliations that unfolded over the following weeks, like a carefully orchestrated campaign. There was the morning Tyler and his crew caught Daniel at his locker in the crowded hallway between first and second period, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the air thick with the smell of industrial cleaner and teenage bodies. Tyler had leaned against the adjacent locker, his posture casual, his voice friendly. "Hey, Danny, can I call you Danny? You settling in okay?" Before Daniel could answer, Jake had jostled him from behind, sending his books tumbling from his arms. As Daniel bent to retrieve them, Brad had kicked them further down the hall, scattering papers and sending his notebook skidding under the feet of passing students. "Butterfingers," Tyler had observed with mock sympathy. "You really should be more careful." They'd walked away laughing while Daniel had crawled on hands and knees to gather his belongings, faces blurring past him, no one stopping to help. There was the afternoon in PE class when Coach Henderson, a former college linebacker who'd blown out his knee and now spent his days shouting half-heartedly at students who couldn't care less about physical fitness, had divided them into teams for basketball. Daniel had been picked last, had stood on the sideline, while Tyler and Jake had conducted a theatrical debate about whether they wanted the Scarecrow on their team. Once in the game, Daniel had found himself targeted with passes that were deliberately too high or too fast, with screens that were really just excuses to body-check him into the bleachers. When he'd finally gotten his hands on the ball and tried for a layup, Tyler had swatted it away with unnecessary force, sending Daniel spinning. "Not in my house," Tyler had declared, chest-bumping Jake while Daniel had picked himself up off the hardwood. There was the incident in the parking lot after school, the California sun beating down on rows of cars that shimmered with heat, the asphalt soft beneath his sneakers. Daniel had been walking to the bus stop when he'd noticed Emma Walsh struggling with an armload of art supplies near her car, a beat-up Honda Civic with a faded "Save the Oceans" bumper sticker. Emma was in his English class, a quiet girl with auburn hair she wore in a perpetual ponytail, freckles scattered across her nose, and a habit of doodling elaborate designs in the margins of her notes. She dressed in layers, flannel shirts over band t-shirts, worn jeans, canvas sneakers covered in paint stains, and she had a smile that transformed her whole face on the rare occasions when she deployed it. Daniel had felt something shift in his chest the first time he'd heard her speak in class, defending her interpretation of a poem with passionate intensity that belied her shy demeanor. He'd approached her that afternoon with the intention of helping, had reached out to steady the portfolio case that was sliding from her grip. "Let me get that," he'd offered quietly. Emma had looked up, startled, then grateful. "Thanks. I always overload myself." They'd been loading her supplies into her back seat when Tyler's truck had rolled up, a lifted F-250 with custom rims and a sound system that announced his arrival with bass that rattled windows. "Well, well," Tyler had called out, killing the engine and climbing down from the cab with Jake and Brad in tow. "Danny, making moves on Walsh. Didn't know you had it in you, Scarecrow." Emma had stiffened, her expression closing off. "Leave him alone, Tyler." But Tyler had sauntered closer, had positioned himself between Daniel and Emma with the ease of someone used to claiming space. "Just being friendly. Danny here doesn't mind, do you, Danny?" He'd clapped Daniel on the shoulder with enough force to make him stumble. "Emma's a sweet girl." but way out of your league, buddy. No offense. Brad had laughed, a harsh bark of sound. Maybe stick to helping old ladies cross the street. They'd driven away with a squeal of tires, leaving Daniel and Emma in awkward silence. I'm sorry about them, Emma had said quietly. Tyler's an asshole. Daniel had shrugged, had muttered something non-committal, had walked away before she could see the shame burning in his face. At home, Daniel lived with his father in a modest rental house in a neighborhood of identical ranch-style homes with yellowing lawns and chain-link fences. Lieutenant Colonel James Reeves was a man of few words and rigid discipline, his grey crew cut and ramrod posture maintained even in civilian clothes, his conversations with his son conducted in brief exchanges about homework completion and chore schedules. He worked long hours at the base and came home exhausted, eating his dinner in front of cable news before retreating to his study to handle paperwork. Daniel understood on an intellectual level that his father loved him, but the emotion existed at a remove, expressed through providing rather than presence, through expectations rather than engagement. Daniel spent his evenings in his small bedroom, a space he'd barely bothered to personalize beyond a few boxes of books still unpacked and a photograph of his mother on the nightstand. A woman with Daniel's same dark eyes and gentle smile, forever frozen at 29. He did his homework with mechanical efficiency, maintaining straight A's, not because he was particularly motivated, but because it was easier than dealing with his father's disappointment. When he finished his assignments, he'd lie on his bed and stare at the ceiling, replaying the day's humiliations, feeling the weight of them accumulate like stones in his chest. He'd stopped training. The base was too far to visit regularly, and besides, what was the point? Master Torres had taught him that martial arts were for self-defense, for protection, for maintaining honor. But honor felt like a luxury Daniel couldn't afford. Fighting back would only make things worse, would mark him as a target, not just for Tyler, but for every student who wanted to prove themselves. So he absorbed the daily cruelties in silence, told himself he was being smart, being strategic, being patient. The breaking point came in mid-October, 6 weeks into the school year, on an evening when the Santa Ana winds had been blowing hot and dry through the valley, making everyone irritable and restless. It was Friday, and someone, probably Devon Hayes, who had a knack for organizing social chaos, had spread word about a party at Tyler's house. Tyler's parents were out of town for the weekend, and his sprawling suburban mansion with its pool and game room had become party central. Daniel had obviously not been invited, had planned to spend his Friday evening the way he spent most evenings, alone with a book and the distant sound of his father typing in the study. But Emma had approached him after English class that day, had caught his arm as he was packing up his battered paperback of East of Eden. Hey, Daniel. She'd remembered his full name, not the diminutive that Tyler wielded like a weapon. Are you going to Tyler's thing tonight? Daniel had blinked at her, confused why she'd be asking. I wasn't invited. Emma had rolled her eyes. Tyler invited the whole school on Instagram. It's not actually exclusive. He just likes people to think it is. Anyway, I'm going. Some girls from the art club convinced me. And I thought maybe you'd want to come too. We could hang out, avoid the worst of the chaos. Daniel should have said no. Every instinct had screamed at him to decline, to maintain his policy of staying invisible. But Emma had been looking at him with those hopeful eyes, and something in his chest had ached at the possibility of connection, of friendship, of being seen as something other than a victim. So he'd found himself nodding, had found himself agreeing to meet her there at 8, had spent the rest of the day in a state of anxious anticipation. Tyler's house was everything Daniel had expected, ostentatious and excessive, a monument to the wealth that insulated certain families from consequence. It sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in the hills above town, a 2-story Mediterranean-style villa with a circular driveway and professionally landscaped grounds. Cars lined the street, and music pulsed from inside, bass-heavy hip-hop that competed with the sound of voices and splashing from the backyard pool. Daniel had walked from the bus stop, had stood outside for 5 full minutes, trying to convince himself to go in, before finally forcing himself through the unlocked front door. The interior was chaos. Students everywhere, cups of beer in hand, conversations shouted over the music, the sweet sour smell of alcohol and vape smoke hanging in the air. Daniel had navigated the crowd carefully, searching for Emma, feeling acutely out of place in his jeans and plain t-shirt among kids dressed for Instagram moments. He'd found her in the kitchen, talking with 2 girls he recognized from art class, and her face had lit up when she'd seen him. "You made it!" "I was worried you'd bail." She'd handed him a cup of Coke. She wasn't drinking either, he'd noted with relief. And they'd found a relatively quiet corner in the living room where they could actually hear each other talk. For an hour, Daniel had felt almost normal. Emma had told him about her plans to study graphic design, about her portfolio, and her dreams of working for a company that made video games. She'd asked him about North Carolina, about what it was like growing up on military bases, and he'd found himself opening up more than he had in months, telling her about the transient nature of base life, about the way you learned not to form attachments because everything was temporary. She'd listened with genuine interest, had laughed at his stories, had touched his arm when she wanted to emphasize a point. For that brief window of time, Daniel had felt seen. Then Devon Hayes had announced that people were gathering in the game room for truth or dare. Emma had groaned. "That's so middle school." But her friends had been enthusiastic, had pulled her along, and Emma had grabbed Daniel's hand without thinking, tugging him with her. The game room was a windowless basement space with leather couches arranged in a circle, a pool table and air hockey set up along one wall, and a massive flat-screen TV that someone had muted. About 20 students had gathered, settling into seats with the particular energy that came from knowing that boundaries were about to be tested. Tyler had been there, of course, holding court from his position on the largest couch, Jake and Brad flanking him like lieutenants. His eyes had found Daniel immediately, and something predatory had flickered across his face. "Well, look who decided to join the party. Danny boy. Didn't think this was your scene." Daniel had tried to keep his expression neutral, had moved to sit with Emma on a smaller couch along the perimeter. Tyler had let it go for the moment, turning his attention back to the game as someone spun an empty beer bottle on the coffee table. The game had progressed predictably. Dares to chug drinks, truths about hookups, the usual teenage theater of proving boldness. Daniel had hoped the bottle would skip him, that he could fade into the background and just be there with Emma. But the bottle had its own mathematics, and when Devon had spun it 20 minutes in, it had pointed directly at Tyler. The room had erupted in anticipation. Tyler was the kind of player who always chose dare, who used the game to demonstrate his dominance. Devon had grinned, sensing opportunity. "All right, Brennan, I dare you to kiss the hottest girl in the room." It was designed to create drama, to force Tyler to choose and thereby insult everyone he didn't choose. But Tyler had been equal to the challenge. He'd made a show of considering his options, his gaze sweeping the circle with theatrical slowness before landing on Emma. Walsh. Definitely Walsh. That whole quiet artist thing? Super hot. Emma had gone rigid beside Daniel. "Don't be gross, Tyler." But Tyler had already stood, had crossed the circle with the confidence of someone who'd never been rejected, had dropped onto the couch beside her. "Come on, Emma." "It's just a game. Unless you're scared." It was a trap, Daniel had realized, a way of making her look uptight if she refused. Emma had glanced at Daniel, something apologetic in her eyes before turning back to Tyler. "Fine. But make it quick." What happened next had unfolded in slow motion for Daniel. Tyler had cupped Emma's face with both hands, had leaned in and kissed her with deliberate slowness, making a show of it for the room. Jake had started a slow clap that others had joined. The kiss had lasted 5 seconds, maybe 6, but to Daniel, it had felt eternal. When Tyler had finally pulled back, he'd made eye contact with Daniel over Emma's shoulder, had winked, the message clear: "I can take anything I want, including this." Emma had wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, had looked shaken and angry. Happy now, but the game had moved on, the bottle spinning again. Daniel had sat frozen, his hands clenched into fists in his lap, his heart hammering against his ribs. He'd felt humiliation burning through him, worse than any physical attack, because this was Emma, the one person who'd shown him kindness, and Tyler had violated that just to prove a point. The bottle had spun twice more before landing on Emma. Tyler, still flush with victory, had called out before anyone else could speak. "I'll ask. Truth or dare, Walsh?" Emma had chosen truth, probably hoping to avoid further contact with Tyler. Tyler's smile had been venomous. "Okay, truth. If you could leave this party right now with anyone in this room, who would it be?" It was another trap, Daniel had understood. If she said Tyler, she'd be admitting he affected her. If she said anyone else, she'd be rejecting the king of the school publicly. Emma had squared her shoulders, had met Tyler's gaze directly. "Daniel. I'd leave with Daniel." The room had gone silent, everyone understanding the significance of her answer. Tyler's expression had darkened. "Interesting choice. Guess you like the wounded bird types." Before Emma could respond, Tyler had grabbed the bottle, had spun it deliberately so it landed pointing at Daniel. "Looks like Scarecrow's up. Truth or dare, Danny?" Daniel had felt every eye in the room on him, had felt the weight of expectation and the certainty of humiliation no matter what he chose. He'd forced himself to meet Tyler's gaze. Dare. He'd said it quietly, but in the sudden silence of the room, it had been enough. Tyler had leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his smile spreading like an infection. "I dare you to fight me, right here, right now. Let's see if you've got anything backing up all that quiet, tough guy bullshit." The room had erupted in reaction, gasps, laughs, someone shouting for them to take it outside. Emma had grabbed Daniel's arm. "Don't! He's just trying to show off." But Jake had already started chanting, "Fight, fight, fight," and others had joined in, the mob mentality taking over. Daniel had stood slowly, his mind racing through calculations. He could walk away, refuse the dare, cement his status as a coward forever, or he could fight, reveal what he was capable of, and face the consequences of breaking his promise to Master Torres, to use his training only when absolutely necessary, only in genuine defense. But this wasn't defense. This was theater, performance, exactly the kind of ego-driven conflict he'd been taught to avoid. Tyler had stood as well, shrugging off his shirt to reveal the sculpted physique of someone who spent hours in the weight room. "Come on, Danny. Show Emma what you're made of. Or are you going to hide behind her like the little bitch you are?" That was the line that had decided it for Daniel. Not the insult to himself, he'd endured worse, but the way Tyler had tried to use Emma as a weapon, had tried to make her the prize in some dominance display. Daniel had pulled off his hoodie, revealing the lean muscle beneath his t-shirt, the product of years of training that his baggy clothes had hidden. He'd moved to the center of the room, had found his stance automatically, weight balanced, hands relaxed at his sides, breathing controlled. Tyler had noted the change in posture, had recognized for the first time that maybe this wouldn't be the easy victory he'd anticipated. But pride and audience expectations had driven him forward. Tyler had swung first, a wide haymaker that telegraphed its intention seconds in advance. Daniel had slipped it easily, had felt muscle memory taking over, had countered with a quick jab to Tyler's solar plexus that landed with a thump of displaced air. Tyler had staggered, surprise flashing across his face. The room had gone silent again, everyone recognizing that something unexpected was unfolding. Tyler had come again, more aggressive this time, throwing a combination of punches that Daniel had blocked and deflected with minimal movement. When Tyler had overextended, Daniel had swept his leg, sending Tyler crashing to the floor with a thud that rattled the windows. Jake and Brad had moved then, stepping into the circle with clear intentions. It was going to be 3-on-1, Daniel had realized. The dare transforming into something uglier. He'd backed toward the wall, had felt adrenaline surging through his system, had been calculating angles of attack and escape routes when Emma had screamed, "Stop! All of you, just stop!" But mob momentum had a logic of its own. Jake had rushed him, and Daniel had responded with a perfect Osoto Gari hip throw that sent Jake sprawling into Brad. Tyler had regained his feet, blood trickling from where he'd bitten his lip in the fall, his expression murderous. "You're fucking dead," he'd snarled, and he'd meant it. He'd pulled something from his pocket, a knife Daniel had registered with spike of pure adrenaline, a folding blade that Tyler had flicked open with practiced ease. The room had erupted in panic then, people scrambling back, someone shouting about calling the cops. Emma had been screaming at Tyler to put it away. Daniel had felt his training sharpen into something cold and precise, Master Torres's voice in his head. When weapons enter the equation, you neutralize or you escape, never freeze. But before Tyler could close the distance, someone else had entered the room. Mr. Nakamura, Riverside Heights night janitor, had appeared in the doorway like an apparition. He was in his 60s, a compact Japanese man with silver hair and weathered hands, dressed in his usual custodian's uniform of khaki pants and blue work shirt. Everyone knew Nakamura in the vague way students acknowledge support staff, as part of the background, invisible. But now he'd stepped into the center of the chaos with absolute calm. "Enough," he'd said quietly, his voice barely raised, but carrying an authority that cut through the noise. Tyler had turned to him, knife still in hand. "Get out of here, old man. This doesn't concern you." But Nakamura had moved with speed that defied his age, had caught Tyler's wrist in a grip that made Tyler gasp, had applied pressure to some nerve point that Daniel recognized from his own training. The knife had clattered to the floor. Nakamura had kicked it away with casual precision. "Party's over. Everyone leaves now, or I call police, and you explain to parents why you're all here." The room had emptied rapidly, students fleeing up the stairs like water down a drain. Tyler had wrenched his wrist free, had snarled something about suing Nakamura and getting him fired, but his eyes had betrayed fear. He'd retreated with his crew, leaving Nakamura standing alone with Daniel and Emma. Nakamura had turned to Daniel with eyes that saw too much. "You have training. I see it in how you move, how you breathe, why you let them push you." Daniel had felt exposed under that gaze. "It's complicated." Nakamura had nodded slowly. "Always is. Come see me Monday morning before school. I work in maintenance shed behind football field. We talk." It hadn't been a request. Then he'd turned to Emma. "You okay, Miss Walsh?" Emma had nodded mutely. Nakamura had gestured to the stairs. "Go home. Both of you. This place holds no good tonight." Daniel had walked Emma to her car, both of them shaken and silent. At her Honda, she turned to him, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have pulled you into that game. This is my fault." Daniel had shaken his head. "Not your fault. Tyler's an asshole, like you said." Emma had touched his arm, the same gesture as earlier, but now weighted with different meaning. "You were amazing in there. I had no idea you could do what you did." Daniel had looked away, uncomfortable with the admiration in her voice. "I shouldn't have. I promised myself I wouldn't." Emma had studied him in the dim light of the street lamp. "Why? Why let them treat you like that if you can defend yourself?" It was the same question Nakamura had asked. The question Daniel had been asking himself for weeks. Because fighting back makes you a target. Because violence just creates more violence. Because, I don't know. It seemed like the right choice. Emma had leaned up and kissed his cheek, quick and soft. Maybe it's time to make a different choice. Thank you for tonight, for standing up. Then she'd climbed into her car and driven away, leaving Daniel alone on the dark street with the taste of change on his tongue. That weekend had passed in a blur of anxiety. Daniel had expected retaliation, had expected Tyler to show up at his house with reinforcements, had expected the story to spread across social media and make Monday unbearable. Instead, there had been silence. His father had noticed his agitation Sunday evening, had paused in his reading to ask, "Everything all right, son?" Daniel had considered telling him, considered explaining the whole situation, but his father had already returned to his book before Daniel could formulate a response. "Yeah, Dad, everything's fine." Monday morning, Daniel had arrived at school 45 minutes early when the parking lot was still mostly empty and the sky was just beginning to lighten from black to grey. The maintenance shed was exactly where Nakamura had described. A small cinder block building behind the football field, surrounded by groundskeeping equipment and smelling of cut grass and gasoline. The door had been open, and Daniel had found Nakamura inside, sweeping the concrete floor with methodical strokes. Nakamura had looked up at his entrance, had nodded as if Daniel's arrival had been inevitable. "Good. You came. Means you ready to learn." He'd leaned the broom against the wall, had gestured for Daniel to follow him outside to a patch of worn grass behind the shed. "Show me your stance." Daniel had complied, had dropped into the ready position Master Torres had drilled into him thousands of times. Nakamura had circled him slowly, making small adjustments with his hands. A slight shift of Daniel's shoulders, a fractional change in weight distribution. Good foundation. "Who taught you?" Daniel had explained about Master Torres, about the base dojo, about the years of training. Nakamura had listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When Daniel had finished, Nakamura had nodded. "Torres is good teacher, taught you technique, discipline, but he didn't teach you most important thing." Daniel had frowned. "What's that?" Nakamura had tapped Daniel's chest. "How to fight when your heart is involved. When it's not just practice, not just defense, but about protecting what matters, that different kind of fight." Over the following weeks, Daniel had arrived early every morning to train with Nakamura. The sessions were unlike anything Master Torres had taught him, less about perfect form and more about adaptation, about using an opponent's energy against them, about the mental game of combat. Nakamura had revealed himself as a master in his own right, though he deflected questions about his background with vague references to old days and different life. He'd put Daniel through exercises that seemed unrelated to fighting, balancing on narrow beams, catching falling objects, performing forms with his eyes closed, but which gradually sharpened his reflexes and awareness. "You too much in your head," Nakamura had told him one morning after Daniel had fumbled a defensive sequence. "Thinking about what could go wrong, what people think. Must be present. Right here, right now. Fight in front of you, not fight you imagine." He demonstrated a technique, flowing through movements with economy and grace that made them look effortless. When Daniel had tried to replicate it, he'd been stiff, mechanical. Nakamura had stopped him with a raised hand. "Again. But this time breathe. Let movement come from center, not from trying." The training had been humbling. Daniel had thought himself competent, had earned his black belt through years of dedicated practice, but Nakamura had shown him how much he still had to learn. More importantly, Nakamura had given him something Master Torres never had: context for why he was learning. "You think fighting is about winning," Nakamura had said one morning while they'd been cooling down after a particularly brutal session. but real fighting about not losing yourself. About staying who you are, even when someone trying to make you into something else. Tyler, boys like him, they win when they make you afraid, make you small. Already won that fight, yes? Daniel had nodded, recognizing the truth. He'd let Tyler define him, had accepted the role of victim because it had seemed easier than the alternative. So what do I do? Nakamura had smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. You become dangerous, not to hurt them, but so they can't hurt you. Then you decide who you are, not them. At school, the dynamic had continued its slow evolution. Tyler had been subdued after the party, had avoided direct confrontation with Daniel while maintaining his campaign of social warfare through proxies. Jake and Brad had made comments in passing, had jostled Daniel in hallways, had spread rumors about him being crazy, unstable, dangerous. Devon had been more creative, posting edited photos on social media that made Daniel look ridiculous, his head photoshopped onto various weak or feminine figures, captions mocking his appearance and his obvious interest in Emma. Emma herself had become more present in Daniel's life. She'd started sitting with him at lunch, ignoring the social cost of associating with the school's designated punching bag. They'd studied together in the library, had discovered shared tastes in books and music, had developed the kind of easy rapport that felt rare and precious. Emma had noticed the changes in Daniel, the way he carried himself with slightly more confidence, the new calluses on his hands, the occasional bruise or scrape from early morning training. You're doing something, she'd observed one afternoon in the library, looking up from her sketchbook where she'd been drawing elaborate fantasy creatures. Something's different about you. Daniel had deflected, had made vague references to working out, but Emma had seen through it. Whatever it is, it's good. You seem more yourself, less like you're trying to disappear. Daniel had wanted to tell her about Nakamura, about the training, about the slow reconstruction of his confidence, but he'd held back, sensing that some transformations needed to happen in silence. Instead, he'd asked about her art, and she'd shown him her portfolio, pages of intricate designs, character concepts, landscapes that breathed with imagination. This is amazing, he'd said honestly. You're really talented. Emma had blushed, had looked simultaneously pleased and embarrassed. Thanks, most people think it's just doodling. But Tyler's patience had limits. The incident at his party had damaged his reputation. Word had spread about Daniel's unexpected combat skills, about Tyler pulling a knife and being disarmed by a janitor. Tyler needed to reassert dominance, needed to remind everyone that the social hierarchy remained unchanged despite temporary setbacks. He'd begun planning something bigger, something public that would humiliate Daniel so completely that no amount of morning training could restore his dignity. The opportunity had come in the form of Riverside Heights' annual Fall Festival, a weekend event that combined a football game, carnival rides, food trucks, and a Battle of the Bands competition. The entire school participated in some capacity, and Tyler had been elected, inevitably, as student body president, which gave him control over major aspects of the festival planning. He'd announced at a school assembly that there would be a new addition to the festivities this year, an amateur boxing tournament, sanctioned by the school and supervised by Coach Henderson, open to any student who wanted to participate. The announcement had been met with enthusiasm from the student body and concern from some faculty. Principal Dawson, a tired-looking man in his 50s who'd been at Riverside for 20 years and had long since lost his passion for education, had approved it over the objections of his assistant principals, swayed by Tyler's argument that it would promote school spirit and provide students with a controlled outlet for aggression. Better they hit each other in the ring with gloves and a referee than in the parking lot, Tyler had said smoothly during the assembly, earning laughs and applause. Daniel had understood immediately what Tyler was doing. The tournament was designed to force him into a corner, either participate and face Tyler publicly or refuse and cement his status as a coward. Emma had been furious when she'd realized the trap. He's manipulating everything. The whole tournament is just about getting you in the ring. They'd been sitting on the bleachers after school, watching the football team run drills on the field below. Daniel had been strangely calm. Maybe it's time. Emma had turned to him sharply. Time for what? To get beaten up in front of the whole school. This is exactly what Tyler wants. But Daniel had been thinking about Nakamura's words, about becoming dangerous not to hurt, but to prevent harm, about defining himself rather than letting others define him. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's time to stop avoiding the fight. Emma had studied his face, searching for doubt or bravado, finding instead a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. You've changed, she'd said softly. These last few weeks, you're not the same person I met in August. Daniel had smiled, feeling the truth of it. He wasn't the same person. The early morning sessions with Nakamura had rebuilt something fundamental in him. Not just physical skill, but the confidence to exist in his own skin, to occupy space without apology. Is that a bad thing? Emma had shaken her head. No, it's just, be careful, okay? Tyler doesn't fight fair. Daniel had taken her hand, surprising himself with the gesture. I know, but neither does life. At some point, you have to stop waiting for things to be fair and just deal with what's in front of you. He'd signed up for the tournament the next day, his name going on the roster that was posted in the gym. The effect had been immediate, buzzing in the hallways, increased attention. Tyler's smile growing wider when he'd seen Daniel's signature. Tyler had approached him at lunch, Jake and Brad flanking him as always, but keeping slightly more distance than usual. Didn't think you'd have the balls, Danny. Respect. The word had been delivered with mockery, but underneath Daniel had detected something new, uncertainty. Tyler had seen what Daniel could do at the party. He didn't know how much more Daniel had learned since then. The tournament had been scheduled for the Saturday of Fall Festival, with the finals taking place under lights after the football game. Daniel had continued training with Nakamura, who'd intensified the sessions once he'd learned about the tournament. Tournament boxing different from street fight, Nakamura had explained. Rules, referee, time limits, but mental game same. Stay calm, stay present, let opponent defeat himself. He'd taught Daniel to read body language, to anticipate punches by watching shoulders and hips, to control distance and timing. Tyler, big, strong, but he fight angry. Anger make you stupid, make you waste energy. You stay calm, stay efficient, you win. But Nakamura had also warned him about the costs. Winning fight easy. Winning and keeping your soul, that's hard. Don't fight to hurt Tyler. Fight to free yourself. Big difference. Daniel had nodded, understanding what Nakamura meant but not yet feeling it in his bones. The distinction between justice and revenge seemed academic from where he stood. Tyler had made his life miserable for weeks. The prospect of returning that pain felt like justice. Emma had been his other anchor during those weeks. She'd started coming to his house after school, ostensibly to study, but really just to be there, to provide presence and normalcy amid the escalating tension. Daniel's father had met her briefly, had regarded her with his usual distant politeness before returning to his study. Emma had raised her eyebrows after he'd left. Your dad's intense. Daniel had shrugged. He's been deployed most of my life. Being emotionally distant is kind of his default. Emma had squeezed his hand. Must be lonely. It was, though Daniel had never articulated it that way. But with Emma, he'd felt less alone. They'd spent hours talking about everything and nothing, her ambitions, his uncertain future, their shared love of science fiction, their theories about teachers' secret lives. Emma had told him about her parents' divorce, about living with her mom in a cramped apartment while her dad had moved to Oregon with his new girlfriend. Sometimes I feel invisible, she'd admitted one evening as they'd been sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind the hills. Like I'm just occupying space until I can leave for college and become who I'm supposed to be. Daniel had understood that feeling intimately. I used to think being invisible was safer, that if nobody noticed me, nobody could hurt me. Emma had looked at him with those perceptive eyes. And now, Daniel had considered the question seriously. Now I think being invisible is just another kind of hurt, hurting yourself before someone else can do it. Emma had leaned her head on his shoulder, a gesture of trust that had made Daniel's throat tight. I'm glad you're not invisible anymore, at least not to me. The days before the tournament had taken on a dreamlike quality, time simultaneously rushing and dragging. The school had been abuzz with speculation and betting pools. Most students had assumed Tyler would destroy Daniel. Tyler was bigger, stronger, had boxing experience from his gym workouts, but a small contingent, mostly people who'd witnessed the party incident or heard about it secondhand, had given Daniel a chance. The underdog narrative had appeal, after all, especially in a school where Tyler's dominance had become oppressive to more people than just Daniel. Tyler himself had been conducting his own campaign, posting training videos on social media showing him hitting heavy bags and speed bags with impressive power and technique. He'd recruited Devon to film promotional content that positioned Tyler as the defending champion and Daniel as the delusional challenger. The videos had been slickly produced and widely viewed, designed to intimidate and demoralize. Daniel had watched them once, had felt Nakamura's advice running through his head. Don't fight on their terms, stay in your own center, and had deleted the social media apps from his phone entirely. The night before the tournament, Daniel had barely slept. He'd lain in bed running through techniques, visualizing scenarios, trying to master the anxiety that wanted to swallow him whole. At 2 a.m, he'd heard his father's footsteps in the hallway, had tensed, expecting to be told to get to sleep. But instead, his father had knocked softly and entered. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves had sat on the edge of Daniel's bed, an awkward gesture that revealed how rarely he performed it. Can't sleep? Daniel had shaken his head. His father had been quiet for a long moment, hands folded in his lap. Your mother, he'd said finally, and Daniel had been shocked because his father never talked about her. She was scared before she died. The cancer had spread, and she knew what was coming. But she told me she wasn't afraid of death itself. She was afraid of not having lived the way she wanted, of having spent too much time being what other people needed her to be. He'd looked at Daniel directly for the first time in weeks. I know I'm not good at this, at being present, at talking about things that matter. The Marines taught me to compartmentalize, to shut down anything that isn't mission critical. But your mother would be proud of you, son, of your discipline, your integrity, and she'd tell you the same thing she told me, don't die having never really lived. It was the longest speech Daniel had ever heard from his father, and the vulnerability in it had brought tears to his eyes. Thanks, Dad. His father had squeezed his shoulder briefly, the closest he ever came to a hug, and had left the room without another word. But it had been enough. Daniel had finally slept. Saturday had dawned clear and hot, typical Southern California October weather, where the temperature climbed into the 80s by noon. The fall festival had taken over the school grounds and surrounding streets, vendors setting up booths and carnival operators testing rides. The football game was scheduled for 3 o'clock, and the boxing tournament would begin in the gym at 6, running concurrent with the evening festivities. Daniel had arrived early, accompanied by Emma and, unexpectedly, by Nakamura, who'd closed his janitorial cart and changed into casual clothes for the occasion. Thought you could use corner man, Nakamura had said simply. They'd entered the gym together, Daniel feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes as word spread that he'd arrived. The gym had been transformed, A regulation boxing ring had been set up in the center of the floor, surrounded by bleachers that were already filling with students, parents, and faculty. The atmosphere had been carnival-like, excited, tinged with the particular bloodlust that comes from anticipation of violence. Coach Henderson had been running registration, checking names against his roster and assigning bout times. There were 12 participants in the tournament, arranged in a bracket system that would culminate in a final match. Tyler's name was in the top bracket, Daniel's in the bottom, meaning they could only meet in the finals if they both won their earlier matches. Tyler had been holding court near the ring, surrounded by his crew and admirers, shadow boxing and radiating confidence. When he'd seen Daniel, he'd waved, the gesture mocking. Ready to get embarrassed, Scarecrow? Daniel hadn't responded. Nakamura had led him to a quiet corner where they'd begun warming up. Stretches, light shadow boxing, breathing exercises. Emma had sat nearby, sketching in her notebook, her leg bouncing with nervous energy. "You don't have to do this," she'd said quietly. "We could leave right now." But Daniel had shaken his head. "Yeah, I do. Not for Tyler, not for the school, for me. I need to prove to myself I can stand up." The first bouts had been amateur hour, students flailing at each other with minimal technique, matches ending quickly via knockout or referee stoppage when one fighter clearly outmatched the other. The crowd had been enthusiastic, cheering and groaning with each exchange. Tyler had fought third against a sophomore named Chris, who'd had more courage than sense. Tyler had dispatched him in under a minute with a devastating combination that had sent Chris to the canvas hard enough to rattle his teeth. The referee had called the fight immediately, and Tyler had raised his gloved fists in victory, while Jake and Brad had whooped from ringside. Daniel's first fight had been against Marcus Chen, a senior he recognized from the debate team, a lanky kid with glasses who'd clearly signed up on a whim and was now deeply regretting it. They'd touched gloves, and Daniel had felt the fear radiating from Marcus, had seen it in his wide eyes and trembling hands. When the bell had rung, Daniel had advanced carefully, had thrown controlled jabs that backed Marcus into the corner without seriously hurting him. Marcus had tried to cover up, had thrown a few wild punches that Daniel had slipped easily. 30 seconds in, Marcus had lowered his hands and said, "I give up. I'm done." The referee had stopped the match, and Daniel had removed his mouthguard to speak directly to Marcus. "You okay?" Marcus had nodded sheepishly. "Yeah, I just realized I have no idea what I'm doing and I'd like to keep my teeth." The crowd had laughed, and Daniel had helped Marcus from the ring, the interaction earning surprised applause. "Good sportsmanship," Nakamura had said when Daniel had returned to their corner. "But don't forget, Tyler, not Marcus. Tyler want to hurt you." The semi-finals had been intense. Tyler had faced Brad in an interesting twist. Apparently, Tyler had convinced Brad to enter so they could have a friendly match that would guarantee Tyler made it to the finals. The fight had been carefully choreographed, Brad taking a dive in the second round after some flashy exchanges that made both fighters look good. Tyler had helped Brad up afterward, all smiles for the cameras, playing the gracious competitor. Daniel's semi-final opponent had been Jake Morrison, Tyler's lieutenant. It had been clear from the bell that this wasn't going to be like the Marcus fight. Jake had come out aggressive, throwing heavy punches designed to overwhelm. Daniel had used his footwork to stay out of range, had circled and jabbed, frustrating Jake with his mobility. Jake had gotten increasingly reckless, telegraphing his combinations, and in the second round, Daniel had caught him with a perfect counter right that had snapped Jake's head back and sent him stumbling. The referee had counted, and Jake had barely beaten the 10 count, standing on shaky legs. The fight had been stopped. Technical knockout, Daniel's hand raised in victory. The crowd's reaction had been mixed, some cheering for the upset, others booing because they'd wanted to see Daniel punished. Tyler had been at ringside, his expression unreadable. But Daniel had seen the calculation in his eyes. Tyler had been reassessing, understanding that this wouldn't be the easy victory he'd anticipated. They'd made eye contact across the ring, and in that moment, Daniel had felt something shift. This wasn't about humiliation anymore. This was real. There had been a 30-minute break before the finals. Daniel had sat in the locker room with Nakamura and Emma, drinking water and trying to steady his breathing. His hands were sore from the impacts, his shoulders burning with fatigue. Nakamura had unwrapped his hand wraps to check for swelling. "You doing good. Better than good. But Tyler different level. He been training for this, waiting for this. He not going to make Jake's mistakes." Emma had been pale, worried. "Maybe you've proven your point. Nobody thinks you're weak anymore. You could forfeit the finals and nobody would blame you." But Daniel had known that wasn't true. Forfeiting would be seen as confirmation that Tyler still owned him, that the fear remained. "I have to finish this," he'd said quietly. Emma had looked like she wanted to argue, but had instead kissed him, quick and fierce. "Then win. And don't get hurt." The gym had been packed for the finals, standing room only, people pressed against the walls and sitting in the aisles. Principal Dawson had made an announcement about sportsmanship and fair play that nobody had listened to. Coach Henderson had called both fighters to center ring for final instructions. Tyler had looked enormous across from Daniel, his reach advantage obvious, his muscles pumped from warming up. He'd leaned in when the referee wasn't looking and whispered, "I'm going to fucking end you. And then I'm going to take Emma home and show her what a real man is like." It was psychological warfare, designed to make Daniel angry, to make him fight stupid. Daniel had felt rage flare in his chest, but had breathed through it, had heard Nakamura's voice, "Stay calm, stay present." He'd met Tyler's eyes without responding, and for just a moment he'd seen doubt flicker across Tyler's face. Then the referee had been separating them, sending them back to corners, and the bell was ringing. Tyler had charged out of his corner like a bull, throwing bombs designed to end the fight early. Daniel had used his footwork, had circled away from Tyler's power hand, had jabbed and moved, jabbed and moved. Tyler had cut off the ring effectively, had herded Daniel into corners where he'd unleashed combinations to the body and head. Daniel had covered up, had absorbed punches on his gloves and arms, had felt the raw power behind Tyler's strikes. This was different from Jake, from anyone he'd sparred with. Tyler was legitimately good, strong and fast with solid technique. The first round had been all Tyler, Daniel surviving more than competing, the round clearly going to Tyler on points. Back in his corner, Nakamura had worked quickly, offering water and advice. "He's stronger, but he already slowing down. You see, he breathing hard, used too much energy trying to knock you out first round. Now you make him chase, make him tired, then you attack." The second round had followed Nakamura's strategy. Daniel had continued to move, to jab, to make Tyler pursue him around the ring. Tyler had grown visibly frustrated, had burned energy with missed punches and aggressive combinations that found mostly air. Midway through the round, Daniel had seen his opening. Tyler overcommitted to a right hand, leaving his body exposed. Daniel had slipped inside and driven a left hook into Tyler's ribs with all his weight behind it. The sound had been audible even over the crowd noise, and Tyler had gasped, his forward momentum stuttering. Daniel had pressed the advantage, had unleashed a combination he'd drilled hundreds of times with Nakamura, jab, cross, left hook, right uppercut. The final uppercut had caught Tyler on the chin, snapping his head back, and Tyler had gone down to one knee. The crowd had erupted, shock and excitement mixing. The referee had started counting, and Tyler had gotten up at 7, waving the referee off, insisting he was fine. They'd finished the round exchanging at a distance, both fighters wary, both hurt. The third and final round had been war. Both fighters had been exhausted, running on adrenaline and stubbornness. Tyler had abandoned technique for raw aggression, winging punches with bad intentions behind them. One had caught Daniel on the temple, sending him stumbling, stars exploding in his vision. Tyler had smelled blood and charged in, throwing everything he had. Daniel had clinched, had held on while his head cleared, had felt Tyler trying to wrestle him down, both of them grappling in the center of the ring while the referee worked to separate them. When they'd been separated, Daniel had made a decision. He'd stopped backing up, stopped circling, and had planted his feet in the center of the ring. Tyler had seen the change, had grinned through his mouthguard, and they'd met in the middle, trading punches toe to toe. It had been brutal and beautiful, two fighters too tired for defense, just throwing punches and accepting what came back. The crowd had been on their feet, screaming. Daniel had felt himself slipping into something deeper than technique, into the place Nakamura had taught him to find, the calm center beneath the chaos. He'd seen openings appearing in Tyler's defense as fatigue made Tyler sloppy. Daniel had slipped a jab and countered with a straight right that landed clean on Tyler's nose, blood exploding from both nostrils. Tyler had stumbled back, and Daniel had followed with a left hook to the body and a right hook to the head that had sent Tyler crashing into the ropes. The referee should have stopped it then, but Coach Henderson had been enjoying the spectacle too much. Tyler had bounced off the ropes and come forward one more time, refusing to quit, and Daniel had met him with a final combination. The same one Master Torres had taught him years ago, the same one he'd drilled until his arms had felt like they'd fall off. Perfect form, perfect execution. The final punch, a left hook, had caught Tyler on the jaw with a sound like a bat hitting a baseball. Tyler had gone down hard, had tried to get up and collapsed again. The referee had finally stepped in, waving off the fight, and the crowd had exploded in noise. Some cheering, some booing, everyone in shock. Daniel had stood in the center of the ring, chest heaving, hands raised not in victory, but in simple exhaustion and relief. The referee had grabbed his wrist and raised his arm, declaring him the winner. Emma had climbed into the ring and thrown her arms around him, crying and laughing simultaneously. Nakamura had been there too, pride evident in his weathered face. You did it. But more important, you stayed who you are, did not become like Tyler. Tyler had eventually gotten to his feet, had stood swaying in his corner while Jake and Brad attended to him. The referee had called both fighters to center ring for the traditional show of respect. Tyler had approached slowly, and for a moment Daniel had thought he might refuse the handshake, might throw a punch, might do something to extend the conflict. But Tyler had extended his hand, and when Daniel had taken it, Tyler had pulled him close. You won, Tyler had said quietly, and there had been something broken in his voice, some fundamental certainty shattered. But this isn't over, except it was. Over the following weeks, the dynamic at Riverside Heights had shifted irrevocably. Tyler's aura of invincibility had been punctured, and like air escaping a balloon, his power had deflated. Jake and Brad had drifted away from him, seeking association with students who seemed more on the rise. Devon had stopped posting mocking content about Daniel and had instead pivoted to making fun of Tyler's loss, the cruel nature of social hierarchies asserting itself. Other students who'd endured Tyler's bullying over the years had found courage in Daniel's victory, had started pushing back in small ways, refusing to accept their assigned roles. Tyler himself had withdrawn. He'd come to school, but had stopped holding court in the cafeteria, had stopped making his presence loud and unavoidable. He'd seemed smaller somehow, diminished not just in status, but in essence. Daniel had watched from a distance, had felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. He'd learned from Nakamura that defeating someone wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about what happened after, about whether you could resist the urge to grind your opponent further into the dirt. 2 weeks after the tournament, Tyler had approached Daniel in the library. Daniel had been studying with Emma, and Emma had tensed when Tyler had appeared, her hand finding Daniel's automatically. Tyler had looked uncomfortable, had shifted his weight from foot to foot like a little kid. "Can I talk to you? Just for a minute?" They'd stepped outside the library into the empty hallway. Tyler had looked at the floor rather than at Daniel. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. For the cafeteria, the parking lot, the party, all of it. I was a dick." The apology had been awkward, clearly not something Tyler was practiced at, but it had seemed genuine. Daniel had studied him, searching for signs of manipulation or sarcasm, finding instead just exhaustion and shame. "Why?" Daniel had asked. "Why did you do it in the first place?" Tyler had been quiet for a long moment. "Because I could. Because it made me feel powerful. Because my dad expects me to be this alpha male who dominates everything, and you were there and you seemed weak and fuck, I don't know. It's not an excuse, I was wrong." He'd finally looked up at Daniel. "You could have really hurt me in that ring. I saw it in your eyes. You could have kept hitting me when I was down, made me look even worse. But you didn't. And I've been thinking about that. About what it means to actually be strong." Daniel had extended his hand, and after a moment of surprise, Tyler had shaken it. "We're good," Daniel had said simply. "Just don't do it to anyone else." Tyler had nodded. "I won't. I promise." And he'd walked away, leaving Daniel in the hallway with the strange sensation of a weight he hadn't known he was carrying, finally lifting from his shoulders. Thanksgiving came and went. Daniel and his father had shared a quiet meal, turkey from the commissary, store-bought sides, conversation limited to logistics of Daniel's college applications. But there had been a new ease between them, a subtle shift in their dynamic. Lieutenant Colonel Reeves had started asking more questions about Daniel's life, about his friends, about his plans. The changes were incremental, but they were there. Emma had become a constant presence. They'd made their relationship official without any grand declaration, had simply fallen into the pattern of being together, of considering each other first when making plans. She'd introduced him to her art club friends, a collection of quirky, creative types who'd accepted Daniel with casual warmth. He'd found himself part of a social group for the first time in his life, found himself actually looking forward to school, not despite the environment, but because of the connections he'd built within it. Nakamura had continued the early morning training sessions, though the focus had shifted from combat to philosophy. They'd worked through katas, had practiced meditation, had talked about life and purpose, and the responsibilities that came with strength. "You changed something at this school," Nakamura had told him one cold December morning, when frost had covered the grass and their breath had misted in the air. "Not just for you, for others too. They see what's possible now. They see that bullies can be beaten, that you don't have to accept being less than you are." Daniel had thought about that a lot as the year had progressed. The tournament victory had become somewhat legendary, the story growing in the telling, until it bore only passing resemblance to reality. But the core truth remained, that a quiet kid who'd been pushed around had stood up, had fought back, had won, and more importantly, had won without losing himself in the process, without becoming the thing he'd been fighting against. In January, Principal Dawson had called Daniel to his office. Daniel had gone expecting trouble, had reviewed his conduct mentally for possible infractions, but instead had found Dawson looking thoughtful rather than stern. "Sit down, Mr. Reeves." Daniel had sat confused. Dawson had leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I've been observing something interesting. Since your match with Tyler Brennan, disciplinary incidents at Riverside Heights have decreased by 40%. Fights, bullying reports, harassment complaints, all down significantly." Daniel hadn't known what to say to that. Dawson had continued, "I'll be honest, I approved that tournament thinking it would be harmless spectacle. I didn't expect it to actually change anything about our school culture. but it seems to have done exactly that. Students who were being victimized have found courage to speak up. Students who are doing the victimizing have thought twice about their behavior, and a lot of that traces back to you, to the example you set. Dawson had opened a desk drawer and pulled out a folder. I'm recommending you for a leadership scholarship through the district. It's designed for students who demonstrate character and positive influence on their peers. Full tuition to any California State University. I think you'd be a strong candidate. He'd slid the folder across the desk. Think about it. Applications are due in March. Daniel had taken the folder in a daze, had thanked Dawson and walked out into the bright January sunshine, feeling like reality had tilted on its axis. Emma had been waiting by his car, and he'd told her about the scholarship, about Dawson's observations. She'd thrown her arms around him, had kissed him right there in the parking lot, without caring who saw. That's amazing. You deserve it. You've earned it. But Daniel had felt strange about the recognition, uncomfortable with being praised for what had felt like simple self-preservation. That evening with Nakamura, he'd tried to articulate the discomfort. I didn't fight Tyler to change the school. I fought him because I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting him define me. Everything else was just side effects. Nakamura had smiled his knowing smile. Best changes always start that way. You fix yourself, you fix small part of world. Ripples spread out from there. Don't diminish what you did by saying it was just for you. Courage is always personal first, then becomes something bigger. The second semester had passed in a blur of normalcy that felt revolutionary precisely because it was ordinary. Daniel had joined the school's martial arts club, had started teaching some basic techniques to interested students. Emma's art had been selected for a regional showcase. They'd gone to movies, had studied together for SATs, had navigated the standard teenage milestones that Daniel had never thought he'd experience. He'd applied for the scholarship Dawson had recommended and had been accepted, along with admission to San Diego State, where Emma was also planning to attend. Tyler had transferred schools in March. His parents had enrolled him in a private academy in the next county, and while the official story was about better academic opportunities, everyone knew the real reason. Tyler couldn't handle being at Riverside anymore, couldn't handle the constant reminder of his defeat, the erosion of his status. Daniel had felt a mixture of relief and regret at the news. He'd wanted Tyler to stay and grow, to become better the way Daniel himself had changed. But he understood the impulse to flee, to start fresh somewhere new where your history didn't follow you. On the last day of school, Daniel had arrived early as usual to find Nakamura already sweeping the maintenance shed, preparing to close it up for the summer. "You leaving?" Nakamura had asked, though he'd already known the answer. Daniel had nodded. "College in the fall. Emma and I both got into San Diego State. We're looking at apartments." Nakamura had stopped sweeping, had leaned on the broom handle. "I'm proud of you, Daniel. Not because you won fight, because you learned what fighting really for, not to defeat others, but to become fully yourself. That lesson some people never learn their whole lives." He'd reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a smooth black stone worn by years of handling. "My master gave this to me 50 years ago in Okinawa. Told me to keep it. Remember that strength must be tempered by wisdom. Now I give it to you." Daniel had taken the stone, had felt its weight in his palm, had felt the enormity of the gift. "Thank you for everything, for seeing me when nobody else did, for teaching me, for believing I was worth the effort." Nakamura had gripped Daniel's shoulder briefly. "You always were worth it. You just needed to believe it yourself." They'd stood in companionable silence, the morning sun climbing higher, the school grounds gradually filling with students arriving for the final day of classes. Emma had found him there, had slipped her hand into his. They'd walked through the campus together, Daniel seeing it with new eyes, the cafeteria where he'd been humiliated, now just a room where students ate lunch, the parking lot where Tyler had mocked him, now just a space where cars were parked, the gym where he'd fought and won, now just a building. The locations that had once felt heavy with dread had become simply what they were, functional spaces without inherent meaning beyond what he brought to them. At graduation 2 weeks later, Daniel had walked across the stage to receive his diploma and the announcement of his scholarship. The applause had been genuine and sustained, students recognizing not just his academic achievement, but what he represented. Proof that the story didn't have to end with the bully winning, that transformation was possible, that quiet strength could eventually speak louder than loud cruelty. His father had been in the audience, in full dress uniform, and when Daniel had descended the stage, his father had been waiting at the bottom with something Daniel had rarely seen on his face, unguarded pride. "Your mother would be so proud," he'd said, voice thick. "I know I don't say it enough, but I'm proud too, of the man you've become." Daniel had hugged his father then, really hugged him, and his father had held him back, the two of them finally bridging years of careful distance in that single moment. Later, at the graduation party Emma's mother had thrown, surrounded by his art club friends and a handful of teachers, including Nakamura, Daniel had felt something he'd never quite experienced before: belonging. Not the desperate need to fit in, but the quiet knowledge that he had a place in the world, had people who valued him, had earned his right to exist without apology or fear. As summer had stretched ahead and college loomed on the horizon, Daniel had reflected on everything that had changed. A year ago, he'd been invisible, diminished, afraid to occupy space in the world. He'd let Tyler define him, had accepted the role of victim because resistance had seemed too costly. But somewhere between that first humiliation in the cafeteria and the final handshake with Tyler in the library, he'd been transformed, not by the fighting itself, though that had been part of it, but by the decision to fight, the choice to say enough, to risk everything rather than continue living as half a person. The victory hadn't been about defeating Tyler in the ring, though that had been satisfying in ways he still didn't entirely understand. The real victory had been internal, reclaiming his sense of self, learning that strength wasn't about dominating others, but about refusing to be dominated. Understanding that courage meant standing up even when you were terrified, especially when you were terrified. Master Torres had taught him the mechanics of combat, but Nakamura had taught him why those mechanics mattered, not to hurt but to protect, not to destroy but to preserve. On a warm July evening, Daniel and Emma had driven to the beach at sunset, had walked barefoot in the sand while waves crashed against the shore and the sky turned impossible shades of orange and purple. Emma had stopped to take photos, her artist's eye capturing the light, while Daniel had simply stood and breathed, feeling the salt air fill his lungs, feeling the peace that came from knowing who you were and being okay with that person. "What are you thinking about?" Emma had asked, camera lowered, studying his face in the fading light. Daniel had considered the question seriously. "I'm thinking about how different everything is from a year ago. How different I am." Emma had smiled, had moved closer to lean against him. "You're not that different. You're just more yourself. All the things that made you you were always there. You just learned to let other people see them." Maybe she was right. Maybe the transformation hadn't been about becoming someone new, but about peeling away the layers of fear and doubt that had obscured who he'd always been. The kid who'd moved to Riverside Heights in August had possessed strength and skill and courage. He'd just been too afraid to access them, too convinced that invisibility was safer than visibility. Nakamura had given him permission to be dangerous, to be capable, to be more than his fears. Tyler had given him a reason to exercise that permission, and Emma had given him someone to be brave for, someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway. The stars had emerged as the sky darkened, pinpricks of light against the infinite dark. Daniel had pulled the black stone from his pocket, had held it up in the starlight. Nakamura gave me this, said it's supposed to remind me that strength needs wisdom. Emma had touched the stone gently. What do you think that means? Daniel had turned the question over in his mind. I think it means that being able to hurt someone doesn't mean you should. That real power is about restraint, about choosing when to fight and when to walk away. Tyler taught me that in a weird way. I could have hurt him worse in that ring. Part of me wanted to, but that would have made me like him, someone who uses strength to diminish others. Emma had been quiet for a moment, then said, "You know what I love about you? You think about things. You don't just react. Even when you have every right to be angry, to want revenge, you stop and consider whether that's who you want to be. That's rare, especially in guys our age." Daniel had laughed softly. "I think I learned that from having an emotionally unavailable father. You spend a lot of time in your own head when you grow up in a house that's mostly silent." They'd stood on the beach as full darkness settled, listening to the rhythm of the waves, comfortable in shared silence. Daniel had thought about the journey that had brought him here, from North Carolina to California, from invisible to visible, from victim to victor, from isolation to connection. None of it had been easy. All of it had required him to make choices that terrified him, to risk the fragile equilibrium he'd constructed, to believe that he was worth fighting for even when nobody else seemed to think so. The truth was that bullies existed everywhere, in every school and workplace and community. There would always be people like Tyler who found their power in diminishing others, who built themselves up by tearing others down. The question wasn't whether you'd encounter them, you would, inevitably, but whether you'd let them define you, whether you'd internalize their assessment and make it your reality. Daniel had almost done that, had almost let Tyler's cruelty become truth, had almost accepted that he was weak, strange, other, less than. But something had stopped him. Maybe it was Nakamura's intervention. Maybe it was Emma's belief in him. Maybe it was his own stubborn core of pride that refused to be completely extinguished. Whatever the catalyst, he'd found the courage to stand up, to fight back, to reclaim his dignity and his sense of self. The lesson wasn't that violence solved problems. Daniel knew better than that. The boxing tournament had been theater as much as combat, a symbolic confrontation played out under controlled conditions. Real life was messier, more complicated, but the core principle remained valid. At some point you had to draw a line, had to decide what you would and wouldn't accept, had to stand up for yourself even if you stood alone, because nobody else would do it for you, nobody else could do it for you. Self-respect had to be claimed, not granted. As Daniel and Emma had walked back to his car hand in hand, sand clinging to their feet, Daniel had felt gratitude wash over him, for Nakamura's wisdom, for Emma's faith, for his father's awkward attempts at connection, even for Tyler's cruelty, because it had forced Daniel to change. He thought about Master Torres back in North Carolina, wondered if the old instructor would be proud of how Daniel had used his training. Decided that Torres would approve of the restraint Daniel had shown, the balance he'd maintained between strength and compassion. College was coming, and with it a whole new set of challenges and opportunities. There would be more Tylers, more moments of doubt and fear and humiliation, but Daniel felt ready for them in a way he hadn't before. He'd learned that he could bend without breaking, that he could endure and emerge stronger, that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite it. Those lessons would serve him well wherever life took him next. The drive home had been quiet, the radio playing softly, Emma dozing against the passenger window. Daniel had navigated the familiar streets, had pulled into her apartment complex, and walked her to her door. "Thank you," she'd said, and when he'd asked what for, She'd smiled. For being brave enough to become friends with me. For showing me that good people still exist. For reminding me that high school doesn't last forever and better things are coming. Daniel had kissed her goodnight, had driven home through empty streets, had found his father still awake in the study despite the late hour. "Good night, Dad," his father had looked up from his paperwork. "Good night, son. Everything okay?" And Daniel had smiled because yes, finally, everything was okay, more than okay. Everything was exactly as it should be. In his room, Daniel had placed Nakamura's stone on his nightstand next to his mother's photograph. Two talismans of two very different kinds of strength. His mother's gentle wisdom and Nakamura's harder-won knowledge. Together they represented the balance he'd been seeking, the integration of compassion and capability, of softness and steel. He'd be taking both to college, carrying them forward into whatever came next. As he drifted towards sleep, Daniel's mind had replayed the year's journey one final time. Every humiliation that had nearly broken him, every moment of doubt when he'd almost given up, every small victory that had rebuilt his confidence piece by piece. And he'd understood something fundamental. The story wasn't about beating Tyler. It never had been. The story was about Daniel beating his own fear, his own internalized sense of worthlessness, his own conviction that he deserved the treatment he was receiving. Tyler had just been the vehicle, the catalyst that forced the confrontation Daniel needed to have with himself. In a strange way, Daniel owed Tyler a debt of gratitude. Without Tyler's cruelty, Daniel might have stayed invisible forever, might have graduated and moved on without ever discovering what he was capable of, without ever learning that he had value beyond his ability to avoid conflict. The last thought Daniel had before sleep claimed him was simple but profound. He'd turned the dare into war, yes, but more importantly, he'd turned war into peace, the internal peace that came from knowing you'd stood up, fought back, and stayed true to yourself in the process. That was the real victory. That was the transformation that mattered. And that was the story he'd carry with him always, not as a source of pride or bitterness, but as a reminder that change was possible, that growth could emerge from pain, and that the quiet kid in the corner might just be the strongest person in the room. Morning came with golden California sunshine streaming through his window, and Daniel woke not with dread, but with anticipation, ready to face whatever the new day would bring, secure in the knowledge that he was enough, exactly as he was, and that nobody could ever take that away from him again.